And welcome. If this is your first time on my channel, don't forget the usual like, subscribe, bell icon, blah, blah, blah. Well, today's video is going to be about detail and textures, primarily for those people who are kind of just starting out sculpting digital miniatures. You know, for 3D printing or what other use you might have for them. And basically, it's trying to find that balance between really fine detail and detail that'll actually print and be paintable. So, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to pop on over here. And we have, right here, my painting practice miniature. I deliberately created this so there would be multiple different textures. There's the hair, there's the cloth, there's the chainmail, there's plate metal, there's skin, there's leather, at the very least for the bag and the boots, the gemstone, nice large gemstone to practice on, and the face of the shield so you can practice some freehand stuff. Now, the point is, what really differentiates these materials is the texture. Now, as we zoom in, we can see that this is actually a decimated model, and it's got some rather jagged polygons, but by pulling out, we can see what we need to see. Chainmail is a texture that is extremely recognizable and extremely unique. So it's the method that you use to create your chainmail. This is pretty much the look you're going for. Now, I gotta say, I have my chainmail going in the wrong direction on this. The rows should be going up and down. But there are a lot of people who have been hoodwinked by Hollywood, and since this looks cooler, thinks this is how it goes, and it's just easier to just let the people who know what they're doing shrug it off. The cloth wrinkles are actually sharp. There are ripples and dips that might be smoother, but you'll have a sharp edge on top and a sharp edge where it folds. You won't have, like, if you take a piece of paper and loop it a bit, it won't fold until you crease it. Cloth creases automatically when it makes wrinkles. Now, I would recommend looking up on how cloth folds for artists, especially sculptors. There's some the bits and pieces that really help. Hair, the way I do it, also has a sharp ridge and a deep pit, but the locks are a bit more erratic, more flowy. They split more, or like they do, right here. Or they merge from two into one, like they do right here. And in general, you're not trying to create the individual hairs, unless you're going for a very large scale figure. You're trying to create the look of the locks and how they flow. Skin is best done by keeping track of the anatomy of the figure, and that's something that could be a whole series of videos in and of itself. Metal is usually, pretty smooth, pretty even, very hard surface. Even ones like this waist plate. It's a pretty hard surface, even though it's a rounded, smooth surface. And leather and cloth can be done mostly the same, but if you really want to differentiate them, leather tends to have fewer wrinkles, but more concentrated in the areas that bend, like on the front and back of the ankles and on top of the toe. Wood, there's any number of ways to make wood. For a weapon shaft for a refined society, you might not actually want to have the wood in the actual shaft of the figure, but for a more primitive, you might. Now with this, I kind of cheated. I used an alpha I made in Photoshop to pull out this wood grain from a flat surface, including the little nails in the boards. But of all of this, one thing you've got to keep in mind is, will it be visible? Will it be enough to be paintable? Well, while you're working on your figure and while you're sculpting away, zoom out a bit until you're about the size that the figure will be. If you can see all of the detail on this print, you will probably be able to print and paint it. You'll notice how tiny the rivets on the shield got, when they're actually probably about as big around as the thumb. Notice that the chainmail on his shirt is much larger than any real chainmail would. You know, the rings are huge. Of course, that falls into the whole same reason why we have large hands, feet, and head on most figures. Why the blade of this sword is so wide and so thick. And that's mostly because it's easier to paint and easier to print. In the old days, let me go ahead and pop back to this. In the old days of miniatures, those were entirely sculpted by hand and mostly not using green stuff. A lot of miniature sculptors in like the early 80s used a material called milliput. It was also an epoxy putty, but it was more granular and not as, stretchy. You ended up with some kind of doughy looking figures, and you had to have these really thick swords because they tended to break in the mold making process if you didn't. Now, when people started moving to green stuff, at least in the earlier days of green stuff, it was a lot easier to get better looking detail on the figure itself, but not so much on the weapons. Weapons still pretty much had to be made out of milliput because green stuff doesn't file well. You can't sand it well, and so you can't get those hard surface edges like you need on things like swords and other weapons. Now, other substitutes were either developed or discovered, so that nowadays people who do physical real-world sculpts prior to mold making can use any number of possible options. There's bronze stuff, which it's got a dark bronze and a tin colored strip, otherwise looks just like a milliput, green stuff strip. Mix it together. It's also a polymer resin, but it's got a much shorter chain, so you can sand it and file it much easier. It's easier to make weapons and things. With digital sculpting, we don't have that excuse. But we have the excuse of we've got to make sure it prints well, both for resin and for FDM. We don't know what the end user is going to use to print. He might use an anycubic photon, or he might be using an Ender 3, which is pretty decently good, or he might be using a no-name third-party Prusa knockoff. And the best quality he can get is still kind of questionable. So we've got to try and make it a balance. Enough detail that those people with the photons and the Wanhao D7s and other resin printers can get a really good, crisp print from it, while still being enough in the form language that the lower quality printers can still get something that looks decent. And printers like the Ender 3 can get something that looks really nice, even if it doesn't have quite the pop that the resin printers have. Like I said, one of the best things to do, zoom out. Make the miniature on your screen about the same size as the miniature that will be on your table. And I got quite a few of these printed out and ready to take to my group for painting practice. And of course, it's too transparent to really activate the auto zoom, but oh well. Now, if you're going to be making something like scales, be warned. There are an almost infinite variation in scales. You've got scales like a snake has, which are kind of leaf-shaped and overlapping. but are relatively even down the length of the reptile. You've got fish scales, which are flat and kind of flappy, but also are overlapping and even, for the most part, in size. Then you move into the more interesting ones, like most lizards actually have scales that butt up against each other. Instead of growing from one end out and then laying flat, they grow from a larger pad into a nodule. Then you have scutes. Scutes are things like on the back of an alligator, or actually the shell of a tortoise or turtle. And these are the larger scale-like areas that form thicker, harder nodules that may or may not have a peak or an unusual shape or striations. In short, you really need to pay attention to what effect you want. Fur. There are as many ways to create a fur effect as there are programs out there on the internet for any purpose. There's any number of ways to do it. Just remember, for the most part, you're looking to create the impression of fur. You don't want to do every single strand. Maybe not quite as distinct as I did on the hair of the figure, but definitely enough to show just the direction of the fur and give it a nice dry brushable texture. Nothing so fine that it can't be painted. And that's one of the key things to remember. Detail that's too fine, whether it can be printed or not, might not be able to be painted. And if it can't be painted, then it's, well, in my opinion, it's wasted detail. Because who's going to want to put a bare gray plastic figure down when everyone else has their figures nicely painted, at the very least to a tabletop level? Well, that's a basic rundown on texture and detail and things to look out for. A good rule of thumb is details that are smaller than the thumb probably won't print, but that will vary depending on the size of your figure's hands. Just eyeball it when it's zoomed away and try to determine, will this print or won't it? Also, one last thing. Details that go in tend to print slightly better and be easier to paint, thanks to dry brushes and washes, than details that stick out. It's just the way things happen. So, I would like to thank you, and goodbye.